not changed on the... Order. We're now at 2:30, so we can commence proceedings on our public piece of business today. We're delighted to welcome the Home Secretary and the Permanent Secretary and the Second Permanent Secretary from the Home Office. We have a number of questions for you, as I'm sure you can imagine, but I know you want to start with an opening statement, so over to you, Home Secretary.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's very kind of you to allow me to do so. And thank you for having me at what I think has always been the best select committee in Parliament. There is certainly a sense of karma for me to be sitting here, and for me and for Diana Johnson, Dame Diana Johnson as well. I think there's probably also a bit of karma from the senior officials, shall we say, who have worked so brilliantly in the Home Office for us over the last 6 months, but who previously appeared before us at the Select Committee. I think they have a sense of karma, seeing us prepare
a little sense for
me
Select
as well,
Committee. Being in the other
exactly.
way around, yes.
So thank you very much for having me. Obviously, the responsibilities of the Home Office are not just extensive, but obviously hugely important. We have responsibility for the Safer Streets mission with the ambition to halve violence against women and girls and knife crime in a decade, alongside rebuilding confidence in policing the criminal justice system, where the most important milestone is around rebuilding neighbourhood policing. And we have responsibility for two of the underpinning foundations for the government's work, both around protecting national security and also strengthening our border security, which means in practice the action to tackle the criminal gangs who have taken hold along the Channel, and the work to bring both legal and illegal migration down. There are two new announcements that we've made today that I just wanted to highlight to make sure the committee had seen them. The first is on policing, where we have set out next year's police settlement, which means an extra funding of £1 billion up to £1 billion into policing. And at a time when obviously the public finances are under pressure, it is a sign of how seriously we take the importance of getting neighbourhood police back onto the beat. That is included as part of the police settlement that we have set out. And then secondly, around national security, where we set out for the House today an update on a series of reforms and progress to prevent radicalisation and terrorism, where we know the primary threat is still Islamist extremism, followed by far-right extremism, with growing levels of mixed ideology extremism, but where we are particularly seeing increased numbers of young people being drawn into terrorist cases. And that's why we've today announced a new youth diversion order that would be introduced and would allow the police to intervene at an earlier stage, as well as measures to strengthen the Prevent programme, including introducing a new Prevent Commissioner to be appointed in the new year to be able to monitor performance and effectiveness. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I wanted to start with some questions around the culture of the Home Office, because it's something you were critical of when you sat in this seat and when you were Shadow Home Secretary. So I wondered what steps you had taken to address those criticisms that you had previously, and what you found being in the Home Office.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I would say I've been very impressed by the dedication, determination of the civil servants right across the Home Office, the incredible hard work, the commitment that so many people have to the core purpose of the Home Office, which is about keeping people safe, whether that's about security of our borders, security of our streets, but fundamentally about keeping people safe. And also the huge amount of work that's been done to support us as new ministers, to support manifesto commitments, and to work really at huge pace on the challenges that we faced. We have, however, made a series of changes that are about addressing some of those historic cultural issues. After the Windrush scandal, which was obviously a huge stain on not just the Home Office but the British state, the Wendy Williams report was accepted by the Home Office at the time, but the Windrush unit had been disbanded. We have restored the Windrush unit, and the idea is that is to be very much the champion for the values that were identified as part of the Williams Review, about whether that is about seeing the face behind the case, whether that is about being able to swiftly respond when concerns are raised by the public, by people who are coming into contact with the Home Office, being able to have that swift response, identifying problems, and also being able to move quickly to tackle things rather than just getting stuck, as I think perhaps the Home Office had done in the past.
Thank you. We're now going to move on to some questions around migration, and I wanted to bring in Paul Kohler.
Thank you. Your government, like the previous government, is talking about the need to reduce immigration. You're also talking, of course, about the need to grow the economy. The immigration is important to growing the economy. How do you square the circle of lowering immigration but growing the economy? And how will you balance the trade-offs between the different sectors that need immigration to function and to increase product?
So the answer is, look, immigration's always been important as part of people coming to the UK over generations to work in public services and to found businesses and so on. But it also does need to be properly controlled and managed so that the system is fair, so that it is effective. And what we've seen over recent years, in just the space of 4 years, we've seen net migration quadruple. And we've seen particularly that be driven by, I think, the trebling of work visas, a huge increase in overseas recruitment, and also to see that often in areas at the same time that training in the UK was being reduced. So you see, for example, something like engineering, where there's been persistently high levels of recruitment from abroad, but actually we'd also seen a reduction in engineering apprenticeships in the UK. Now, to my mind, that is a system that is broken, that is just not working. So that is why what we want to do is we do believe net migration needs to come down. We do think that that those record high numbers were not the right thing for the UK. We have to bring those net migration numbers down, but we have to do so in a way that recognises it was that overseas recruitment that had driven a lot of the increases, and therefore what we need is a new system that means we are better linking the immigration system with requirements for training, for skills, for looking at the UK labour market. And the Migration Advisory Committee, I think, has just published their report today, which I've not managed to see the whole of their report yet, but I've seen some of the elements of it. But that is very much looking at the issues, how you link what the Migration Advisory Committee does, but with Skills England and the Scottish, Welsh and other local skills organisations, and also the work that the DWP needs to do around bringing more people back into the labour market, and also the work around the Industrial Strategy Council around what private sector workforce strategies should be, so that we do much more to recruit from the UK alongside having stronger visa controls in place.
Addressing the training deficit will take a long while to feed through into the system. You're talking about reducing immigration very swiftly. How do you square that?
So I think you also have to have the stronger visa controls in place. So the policies that were introduced by the previous government after the Brexit implementation ended up with having things like a 20% discount for wages for overseas recruitment. I just think that was completely the wrong approach. It actually encouraged undercutting. It was a sort of an incentive for overseas recruitment rather than an incentive to recruit or train in the UK. There were also, I think, the salary threshold wasn't increased for a very long time. So you've got to have the proper visa controls in place, but alongside the visa controls, what we want is to also see much stronger links to look at where you need skills training or other workforce policies in the UK as well. I'll give you another one of the things that we've done is to ask the Migration Advisory Committee to look particularly at IT and engineering, because those are sectors where we know there's been high levels of recruitment from abroad, and actually look in much more detail at why have there been such high levels of recruitment from overseas and what more could be done swiftly to actually address some of those issues in the UK.
And talking about particular sectors, there will be different pressures in each of those. Are you talking to the universities? Are you talking to the health and social care sector and those departments to address the specifics?
So our plan is to publish a white paper in the new year that will set out how we bring net migration down, and will set out much more detail about how we want the new system to work, about how you link, how you just have a much more coherent approach to the labour market, how you link the work of the Migration Advisory Committee with those other organisations as well. So that does need to then link into other organisations through from universities, training bodies and so on, and also recognise particular sectors. So on the social care sector, for example, we need a proper workforce strategy for social care. We've talked about having fair pay agreements, for example, in place for social care as well. So you have a proper medium-term strategy for sectors instead of what to me all just felt like what we ended up with was almost a sort of free market approach to the labour market and to migration, which is effectively a free-for-all for employers to be able to just recruit from wherever they wanted to. And especially when you'd got some of those discounts, especially when it was too easy for the exploitation to take place, then too often what you got was employers recruiting from overseas, when actually what we should have had was much more of a workforce strategy here in the UK.
I look forward to the white paper. Do we know when?
I will not set out the precise week or month. You know that would be unwise for any government minister to do, but it would be. We will be publishing that in the new year.
Okay, thank you.
Just two questions from me to follow up. So the first one, you've talked about talking to the various skills bodies. Does that mean you'd be looking at having regional immigration, differences in regional immigration, if Skills Scotland says they want something different from Skills England?
So the Migration Advisory Committee already has to look at what the different labour market challenges might be in different parts of the country, because of course that is going to vary, but we have a national immigration system. And so you need to have the approach to visas and to visa controls needs to be a national one.
Okay. And you talked about on unethical employers. Obviously, the GLAA has had a really big role on unethical employers. With that being now folded into the Fair Work Agency,
yes.
That's it. I have a concern that will be a body that sits underneath DBT, but the policy body still is in the Home Office. How will you make sure that the Home Office is still able to ensure that your policy priorities are delivered by that agency?
So our intention is that this is about strengthening action against exploitation, and some of that will be exploitation of UK resident workers. Sometimes that will be exploitation of people who have been recruited from overseas, but overall we need to be tackling exploitation much more widely. So the intention of the legislation, the intention of the policy is substantially to strengthen that exploitation. But what we are then wanting to do is to link that work and that exploitation, the action against exploitation, with also stronger penalties in the immigration system. So if you have employers who are breaching other aspects of employment law, for example, persistently not paying the minimum wage to any of their workers, to be honest, they just shouldn't be allowed to use the immigration visa system and to be sponsors who are recruiting from abroad. So we look at all of the aspects, but we integrate the enforcement approach we want to take from the immigration point of view with the enforcement approach that we want to take from a broader employment point of view as well. One of the other things we're obviously doing is a lot of focus around illegal working enforcement, where we've had a 33% increase in enforcement raids over the summer. That has led to a big increase in arrests as well, and also to an increase in prosecutions. So 6 employers have been prosecuted for illegally employing people since the election. That is a very substantial increase. I think it had been, over the previous 2.5 years, there had been 4 prosecutions, which was very low. It's still nowhere near where it needs to be. We've obviously got to keep up that action, but it's a sign of accelerating work in that area.
Jake Richards wants to come in.
Just on the link that Paul was asking about between skills and immigration, I just wanted to ask about the immigration skills charge. So this was introduced in 2017, designed partially at least to confront that mischief, if I can put it like that. But it seems like that money just goes into Treasury coffers and is not spent on skills specifically at all. I just wonder whether the government has any plans to reform that or look at it.
So one of the things that we'll do in the white paper is set out better the links between, I sort of sometimes think of it as a kind of a quad arrangement. So you'd think of the approach that employers need to take, which is as represented effectively by the Industrial Strategy Council, the approach that we need to take to get more people back into work, to be able to tackle some of the problems of inactivity, which is the sort of DWP side of things, then to look at the skills side of it, which in England is Skills England, but will be other bodies across the country and also has the mayoral role. And then the fourth side of it will be the Migration Advisory Committee. I think the immigration skills surcharge is obviously, look, that's been an important part of saying, well, employers need to do their bit, and as sponsors, they need to do their bit as well. But I think there's never been a clear enough link about what the requirements are on employers, particularly in key sectors which have consistently recruited from abroad, where there's been lower levels of training in the UK for a very long time. I mean, people have been raising concerns, for example, about digital skills and digital training levels in the UK for a very long time, but we've still got these very high levels of overseas recruitment on IT. So that sort of skills surcharge, that is not working as a system to sort that. We need to look at kind of new approaches, and I think particularly to look at key workforce areas where there are the high levels of overseas recruitment.
And just on skills, clearly student numbers has always been one of the matters in the immigration figures that has been a topic of discussion. Do you intend to keep student numbers in the overall migration figures?
I think international students are always really important to the UK. They bring, obviously, investment into the UK. They also bring those long-term links to countries all over the world. So I think the international students will always be important. We supported from opposition the changes the previous government had made around dependence for the short-term graduate courses, medium-term graduate courses, and I think that was the right thing to do. Sometimes people kind of say, well, can you cut the figures in different ways? Ultimately, we've said our focus is on looking at the net migration for work in particular, but the overall net migration needs to come down. Within that, we'll continue to support international students coming to the UK to study, because I think that's a good thing to do.
But you'll keep them in the figures?
I think I'm not sure it makes that much odds. Do you know what I mean? The numbers are there. They are real. And you can add them up in different ways.
Paul Kohler wants to comment.
Will universities be free to admit as many qualified overseas students as they can, or will there be limits placed on them?
So we continue to think international students are very important. I do think universities, however, also may need to make sure that their systems are not being misused, and there have been cases in the past where we've had misuse around student visas, and they also need to ensure that there is adequate housing in the local area for graduate students, for example, who are being recruited and so on. So there are systems around, the sort of visa arrangements for students, and I think it's important that it's not just sort of done as universities operate in isolation away from the broader issues with local councils and communities about making sure that housing and so on is provided. But my sense has always been that universities are keen to do that.
And subject to that, they are free.
They, I think, will continue to work with universities and with other organisations just on making sure that we've got both the benefits of international students coming to the UK, but also so we make sure that there are proper rules in place so you don't have misuse, and also proper arrangements for housing.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask about the e-visas system that's due to come in, which is, of course, the system moving from physical documents for people with visas to a digital document, which obviously does make sense, but is a fantastically complex administrative task for any department to do. So it was due to come in a couple of weeks, but you've decided to push it back only slightly. I wonder if you could tell us what prompted your decision to push back e-visas coming in and how confident you can be that you can solve those by April when you want to move over.
So this is something that Seema Malhotra, obviously our Minister for Migration and Citizenship, has spent a lot of time working through the detail on this. I think the intention behind the e-visa system is absolutely the right one. To have a sort of digital approach to borders and to visas means you can have a much more streamlined approach to people travelling to and fro across borders. Means you can also have much more effective checks, swift checks around employment and housing and all of those kinds of things. And also makes for actually helps tackle fraud, helps tackle all of those sorts of problems, makes for a much more effective system as well. We did review the plans. We inherited it from the last government, right, that they should intend to do so, but we did review the plans after the election. And I think effectively what we were doing was sort of applying a Windrush test to it, applying a test to say, what is the risk that some people might end up with this not working? Even if for the majority of people it works, you have people who get caught in the system who are unable to verify their identity or don't have the right documents or who are vulnerable. And it was for that reason, and Seema Malhotra has been going through in a lot of detail, that we concluded that the implementation, effectively there needed to be an extended implementation period to provide more time to make sure that we don't have a sort of drop-dead moment when everything has to be implemented by, but actually not all of the systems are in place or not everybody has got their e-visa and their UKVI account set up and running. We do still urge everybody to get their UKVI account set up, but we will allow the existing biometric permits to be used for travel documents in the meantime for the first few months as part of that phased implementation. So it's not really a delay to the implementation, it's more saying what we're doing is a phased implementation to make sure that we can address any problems as we go. And we will keep all of that under review. It's more a sort of set of principles in our approach that we're taking.
Great, thank you for that, and it's reassuring to hear you draw the parallel with Windrush, because what we know is that even 0.1% of people being caught up in these systems can have catastrophic effects for them. So I wonder, do you know how many people still are needing to sign up for their e-visa and get their UKVI account? And what are you doing to make sure that number rises to 100% of people?
So the number does change sort of week by week because of the numbers of people where the permits run out, the new ones are granted, and so on. So, and also people leave the country and so on. So it's the numbers are fluid, but overall it's estimated that's around 4 million people who have biometric permits and who need to switch to e-visas. More than 3 million have registered already for the UKVI account, and we have a lot of work in place, including support through different local organisations and so on, to try and encourage people to sign up as rapidly as possible.
Great. I'm ready to...
Yes, you can.
So I'll move on to another topic if I can, which is the new Border Security Command. So obviously this is one of the government's big priorities. It's an issue that a lot of our constituents care about, and it monopolises a lot of attention. So I wonder if you can tell us how the Border Security Command, how does that differ from the kind of things we've seen before, and how therefore do you see it having a different effect?
So what we had previously, we had the Small Boats Operational Command. That is a really good set of operations. So led by Duncan Capps, and it is extremely effective work that it does, and operates along the channel, and also does the security checks operations at Western Jetfoil. And a lot of the work that Duncan does is also directly with the immediate French counterparts as well around what the operations in the channel. That's really important. But what the Border Security Command does is bring together not just the work of the Small Boats Operational Command, but actually the prevention work that goes much further back along the criminal smuggler supply chains and networks, for example, that looks at the much broader issues around border security that include Border Force, include the National Crime Agency, includes the work of the Home Office intelligence teams, includes the work of the Foreign Office, includes UKIC, the UK intelligence and security communities, and for example, is Martin Hewitt, who's the lead border security commander who appointed earlier this year, has been with me on the trips to Iraq, where we have been talking to the Iraqi government and the Kurdistan authorities about the stronger work we can do together and the stronger action that can be taken against some of the criminal smuggler gangs that operate, the Kurdish Iraqi gangs, where the Kurdish and Iraqi authorities want to take much stronger action against those gangs. We want much stronger action taken against them. So too do the French authorities, because they're operating in northern France. So too do the German authorities, because a lot of them are operating through Germany as well. But there's been no coordination of that work to go after those gang networks. As a result of the work by the Border Security Command and Martin's work, we are talking now to particularly to Germany and to Europol about a much stronger Europol task force operation against those Kurdish Iraqi gang networks, and stretching all the way along that route and linking in with the Kurdish and Iraqi authorities as well. That is part of the Border Security Command. That would never have been part of the Small Boats Operational Command.
Okay, thank you for that. I understand the point you're making, and I think that the analysis that it's very international makes sense. I sort of wonder whether the task being set for this command is enormous and actually able to be done. I understand your diagnosis, but how will this command actually be able to do that? You've listed a huge number of countries and a huge number of policy areas. Is that really possible for one command to pull that off?
So we're investing £150 million over the next 18 months in establishing the command and also strengthening resources. That includes some additional resources for the National Crime Agency and their investigators as well. The model that we based this on was the Office of Security and Counter-Terrorism that was set up under the last Labour government after 9/11 and 7/7, which was a way of approaching the counter-terrorism work that was needed, that didn't really exist in a coordinated way before those appalling terrorist attacks, and that needed to be pulled together. And what the OSCT did was it pulled together the work of the intelligence agencies, also the work of counter-terror policing, but also the prevention work, so the prevent work in local authorities and so on as well. So it was effectively the overarching work. It's not going to replace the work of the National Crime Agency. We need the National Crime Agency to be doing the work with Europol, to be doing the work with law enforcement across Europe, for example. It doesn't replace the work of the Border Force, who do the actual checks when people arrive in the UK. But what it does is become the overarching coordinating approach that can draw all of those together, so we have a coherent strategy that over time will be more broadly around border security, but right now the priority is the smuggler and trafficking gangs that are operating in the Channel, because those gangs are undermining border security and putting lives at risk, and that has to be the priority, going after those gangs.
Thank you. And then one further question, which is maybe two further questions. That sounds like a lot of engagement with other countries and working with the European countries that you mentioned, but also up further afield. Can you tell us a bit about how that's going to work in practice? Because there was a lot of stuff that happened before, and obviously that was before Brexit, but also before the international immigration flows changed as much as they have. So how are you sure that this is going to be up to date and ready for the challenges of 2025 rather than those of 10 years ago?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have had the meeting of the Calais group last week, which was UK, France, Germany, Netherlands and Belgium interior ministers. And I met with the Italian Interior Minister at the weekend, got further conversations with the French and German Interior Ministers coming forward. And what we are very much trying to do is to have the work to strengthen the law enforcement across our borders, because if criminal gangs are operating across borders, law enforcement needs to operate across borders as well. We've lost quite a bit of that law enforcement cooperation, is the reality in recent years, and we want to rebuild it. I think having looked at the way in which the law enforcement takes place, it really is much, much weaker than it should be in terms of that cross-border law enforcement across all of our countries. I think there is a kind of growing interest now really across a lot of European countries about wanting to go after those criminal smuggler gangs, and that now becoming a shared priority, and it's why it was a central part of the G7 agreement that we reached. But some of it does involve things like changing laws, and so as part of the agreement with Germany, they have agreed to strengthen their law so that it's possible to go after the supply chains. The boats that are being held in warehouses in Germany, it was actually becoming too difficult for German law enforcement to go after them. They weren't being used in Germany, they weren't putting lives at risk in Germany, so actually they need to be able to strengthen their law so that they can go after the people who are organising those supply chains, which ultimately are putting lives at risk.
And question from me. I mean, clearly we were part of Europol and we had the European arrest warrant and everything else. We're not there now. Are you considering rejoining any of those Justice and Home Affairs measures?
So we're clearly staying out of the EU, and therefore that means we're out of several of their legal frameworks and have to do the cooperation on a different basis than we had before. But what we're trying to work to do is to get as much of that cooperation in place as possible, because I think law enforcement ought to be an area that there is just a sort of shared interest across borders. So we're looking at particularly the areas around Europol task force. We can still be part of Europol task forces. We obviously can't lead them, but we can be part of them and we can work closely with other European countries on them. And also to get better information sharing. We do have really good arrangements for intelligence sharing around terrorism, for example, but we don't have those around crime. We don't have those around organised immigration crime. So that is one of the things we're working to strengthen. It would make it much easier to be able to go after some of those criminal gang networks.
Sean Davis.
Thank you, Chair. Just clearly, it's a key mission, a foundational mission of the new government. What appetite do you detect from our European colleagues, and where does this sort of feature in their prioritisation? You mentioned Germany, for example. Why would they want to prioritise this piece of work using their own assets of state?
So what the German Interior Minister, Nancy Faeser, would say about this is you've got the same criminal gang networks that are operating in Germany as are operating in northern France, organising boats across the Channel and stretching across Europe as well. So that is causing challenges in Germany. For some of the smuggler networks, for example, are facilitating dangerous journeys into Germany and also facilitating dangerous journeys into the UK as well. And some of those networks are also involved in other kinds of organised crime, which also cause real challenges in other countries as well. So particularly some of those Iraqi Kurdish networks, and there are other networks as well. It's just that those happen to be the ones we've been working with the Iraqi government on. Those networks also particularly affect Germany too. In France, the French Interior Minister has, in the last month, announced additional French resources into northern France. for policing along the coast and going after the gang networks, including a new prefect, so effectively new chief to be in charge and coordinating those operations. That is also incredibly welcome, and we're very keen to work more closely with them as well.
Just think about our European colleagues, though. Is there more that they can do, or are you impressed by what they've done up until this point? Because clearly, in order for this government to achieve its ambitions to smash the criminal gangs, we do need European colleagues and international colleagues, for that matter, to cooperate and see this as a matter of urgency for their own states as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Italian conversations I've had in Italy the weekend, the shared interest is around going after the illicit finance. So the Italian government has been doing a huge amount. They've got parallel challenges with boats across the Mediterranean. And interestingly, the work they've done on a combination of law enforcement but also prevention work upstream, particularly around North Africa, has led to a reduction, a very significant reduction, more than a 50% reduction in Mediterranean boat crossings over the last year. And the thing that they are very keen to work with us on is the illicit finance, some of the Hawala banking networks, some of the networks that are being used to underpin the smugglers, where both Italy and the UK have significant expertise in finance. It is true that we need that cooperation, and that's why we're spending a lot of time working on that, because I think the best way to strengthen your border security is to work with neighbours on the other side of those borders who face the same challenges, rather than just sort of standing on the shoreline shouting at the sea.
Paul Kohler.
Thank you. One of the drivers of irregular arrivals is, of course, the relative paucity of safe and legal means of entering the UK. Has the Home Office looked at any ways in which we can increase the number of safe and legal passages and routes?
So I think, I mean, look, the UK will always need to do its bit alongside other countries to help those who have fled persecution. That's obviously what we've done with the Ukraine programme, with Hong Kong, with Afghanistan and so on. And we have made some changes to the Afghanistan arrangements earlier this year to help reunite family members who had been separated in the evacuation of Kabul, because that hadn't been done. But I think all I would say on this is I really strongly do not think that is an alternative to going after the criminal gangs and the work that we need to do in law enforcement to prevent the small boat crossings. And the reason that I would say this is because you can look at the 2022 is a really clear example of what happened, where you had that big increase in numbers, where some of the gangs were effectively doing a massive advertising campaign in Albania. And the criminal gangs will just advertise to fill the spaces that they have. If they have got spaces on these incredibly dangerous boats, they will run advertising campaigns to fill them. Because for them, this is a criminal industry that is based on them making hundreds of millions of pounds of profit from putting lives at risk. And so if we let them get away with it, and they have been getting away with it for far too long, they will just keep advertising, whether it's on TikTok, whether it's on different forms of social media, and they will just keep putting people into these incredibly dangerous boats. And it's worth sort of talking to some of the people at Western Jet Foil about the way in which they have to respond, because these flimsy boats, and what happens is they can fold inwards as well, and they put the women and children in the middle of the boat. So when the boat folds, they can end up being crushed. It's not just that people drown, they can also end up being crushed to death because of these incredibly dangerous, they're effectively these death traps that the gangs are profiting from. So that's why I think you've got no alternative but to go after the criminal gangs.
It's not an alternative. Is it part of the solution, or are you saying there's no prospect of expanding safe and legal routes into the UK?
I think we already have different forms of safe routes. That will always need to be part of the UK system, and that is one of the things that we did with the family reunion for Afghanistan as well. So that will always need to be part of it, and all countries will always need to do their bits as part of that. But I think it's just not an alternative to the kind of enforcement we need against the criminal gangs who are making such huge profits.
Around.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Home Secretary. the government have committed to significantly increasing returns, and I wondered if you've talked about some of the coordination and international cooperation, but I wondered if you could outline further what steps you are taking to increase the number of returns of people who don't have the right to be in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, so we increased immediately after the election. We moved, it was up to 1,000 staff into the returns and enforcement work more widely. And that has been looking both at direct returns. We've had 13,500 returns since the election. That includes 33 charter flights and I think 4 of the biggest charter flights that the Home Office has ever operated, and a 25% increase in enforced returns as well. And the principle behind this is that the rules need to be respected and enforced for people to be able to have confidence in the system, for us to be able to restore order to both the asylum and the immigration system. We have to be able to really restore order in that way. We are also, of course, some of that is about the actual organisation of the returns, some of it is about the earlier stages of enforcement, and that's why I've also set out the details about the increases, for example, in the raids on illegal working as well, and some of the checks on employers that we're doing as well. So it's a broader approach to returns and enforcement. We've been looking at some of the key arrangements for different countries. In some areas, then obviously you want to try and get actual formal returns agreements. In other areas, it's simply about making the existing systems work more effectively and trying to troubleshoot some of the arrangements about how fast you can get papers in place, how much you can get quick agreements with other countries. So we have that work underway as well.
And returns agreements are obviously, as you say, part of the jigsaw in terms of making sure that we can swiftly return people who have no right to be in the United Kingdom. So we've seen the new returns agreement that's been signed with Iraq, but of course we did already have a returns agreement with Iraq. In terms of that agreement and the work the government's doing, how can we have confidence that these efforts are going to be different and ultimately succeed where previous governments' efforts failed?
So we've had, I think, previous returns arrangements with Iraq, and what we agreed as part of the work when I visited was to strengthen those returns arrangements. There's a lot more work we still want to do. The actual numbers of returns to Iraq have actually still been relatively low. And we think there are a series of further things that we want to do and that we discussed doing in partnership with the Iraqi government. Some of that is around just the issuing of papers, including issuing of documents by the Iraqi embassy here in the UK. Some of it is around looking at the issues around what the travel arrangements are, the most effective travel arrangements. So there's a lot of work that is underway at the moment that hopefully I can update the committee on in the new year about the work that we are doing jointly with the Iraqi government to try and speed up and troubleshoot some of those systems and problems.
Ms. Murray.
Can I just come in briefly on returns with one follow-up, which is I want to talk about voluntary returns, because obviously returns have increased, but voluntary returns have increased. I absolutely accept that, but they're still at a lower level than they were 12 years ago when net migration was a third of what it is today. So I wonder, do you have a plan to sort of focus on involuntary returns, and don't you see them as the low-hanging fruit we could be pursuing to increase returns?
So yes, that is absolutely part of our work, because actually making it easier for voluntary returns is obviously a much simpler, much more effective way to arrange things. And many of the charter flights that have been organised are charter flights for voluntary returns. So that's a lot of what has been taking place.
There's clearly a global angle here and a multilateral angle. Are you working with partners to encourage the UN to take further steps to look at global migration flows. I mean, this affects the whole world. So, this is surely something that the General Assembly should be looking at, more annual heads of government meetings about it, maybe a draft returns agreement, a model returns agreement that could be implemented. Are you working on those kind of areas as well?
So we obviously already work with the IOM on some of the returns arrangements, some of the voluntary returns arrangements, and that's something that's been in place for some time. And actually, interesting, while I was in Italy, one of the meetings I had was with the Italian UNHCR and IOM representatives, just talking about the work that they were doing, including around making sure that some of the safe returns arrangements that Italy is operating as well. So I do think there is more that we can do internationally on this. It's clear that EU countries are trying to work together on better returns arrangements for those countries. So there is an interesting question for us about how we might work alongside the work that they are doing, especially if there are returns arrangements. For example, if we've got good returns arrangements in place that other countries want to replicate the arrangements that we've got, and vice versa, the more that we can do that, the better, because actually if people can travel safely, if people who don't have a right to be in another country can travel safely back to their own homes, that is obviously much better for all countries.
Secretary, just in terms of the push and pull factors, climate change, war, jobs, skills, what is your measure of success? Is it migration numbers going down or return numbers going up? How do you measure success in that space? So
we need to increase returns, because I think we just need to increase the credibility of the system. If there's no proper sense that the rules are respected, that the rules are enforced, then people don't have confidence, whether that is in the asylum system or the immigration system. And returns are still significantly lower than they were under the last Labour government. So you've seen over an extended period of time those problems, even if there had been work done in recent years. And so I think that you always have to have a system of respect for the rules. And that's about restoring order to the system. Of course, we also need to be preventing dangerous journeys in the first place. There is an interesting phrase that the Italian government use. They talk about the right not to migrate. In other words, the right to have a safe home, to be able to get a job in your own home country, to be able to feel like you've got a future in your home country, rather than feeling that the only way to find a future is in order to make a dangerous journey. And therefore, you also need to have that international work around how do you prevent people needing to travel or to make dangerous journeys in the first place. And that's a lot of the work that they have done, particularly in North Africa, about preventing journeys across the Mediterranean.
Just very quickly, do you see the role of DIVIT and the International Development Fund as crucial in terms of this Home Affairs effort you're talking about now?
So it was actually one of the first things that we did after the election as part of the European Political Community event, was actually the Foreign Office announced additional investment. From memory, it was over 80 million. And I now can't remember whether it was 84 million or 92 million, but it was additional fund to work alongside other European countries on exactly that prevention work further upstream. And so the UK has now become part of what they call the Rome process, the Mattei plan, which has been an Italian-led programme to look at some of the prevention work further upstream.
Jenny Reid?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Home Secretary. Just quickly picking up on the previous point about voluntary returns. Are you confident that the process is streamlined and it hasn't been caught up in any kind of backlog accidentally caused by the previous government? And the only reason why I ask that is because I've got a detention centre in my constituency, and I understand there are people who would be very keen to go home, but it's seemingly not as easy as one would expect.
So I think if you've got cases where there are voluntary returns and that is not being progressed as swiftly as it could be, then I think I and Angela Eagle, the Border Security and Asylum Minister, would be extremely keen to follow up that with you to make sure that we can make progress. Obviously, in general, the detention centres tend to be used for the enforced returns. And we know that there can be cases where there end up being difficulties around the final arrangements and so on. But if you have got cases where there are voluntary returns that we could speed up, then we'd be very keen to follow up.
Nick Richards.
Yes, I should have also declared an interest in that a family member works for the Home Secretary. I forgot to do that previously. I just want to ask quickly about immigration detention and the Brooke House inquiry. So in 2023, that was published. It made 33 recommendations. Last year, before the election, it seemed to emerge that the previous government had only accepted one of those recommendations, and then in response to a written question last month from Minister Angela Eagle, it's implied that 30 recommendations have been accepted and progress is being made. From that, is that right then that the two remaining ones that have been rejected by the last government remain rejected? That includes the 28-day time limit, I think. And then secondly, what progress is being made and what plans, if any, of the department got to set out their approach to those recommendations in a sort of coherent and compelling manner?
So I'm going to probably ask Matthew or Simon to follow up on this, because obviously a lot of the work around the Brooke House Immigration Removal Centre took place before the election as well. There were sort of 10 areas of concern that were raised in the report, and obviously there were a lot of very serious issues raised by this report. It was a really troubling report around standards, and in any of these issues around removal centres, detention, the highest standards have to be maintained. That's why the inspectorate, the work of the independent monitoring boards and the inspector of prisons is immensely important here as well. So my understanding is that positive progress is being made against the 30 accepted recommendations, and the 12 of them have been completed already, with the rest of those that were accepted on track for summer of 2025. But Matthew or Simon, follow up.
That's exactly right, Home Secretary. So we've accepted 30 of the recommendations. We have completed the implementation of 12 of them, and we continue to work on the rest. We didn't accept the remaining recommendations, including on time limit on detention. And the reason for that is because, at the end of the process of removal, new barriers are often brought up by legal representation and by individuals, and with a time limit, there's an incentive to do it at the last minute. And there's a risk that we frustrate the process of removal. We obviously seek to complete the process as quickly as possible in all cases, but there can be very difficult to remove cases for various legal reasons or operational reasons about getting the right papers from their home country or other things.
Cola.
I press you on the time limit, Home Secretary. In the other place early this year, Baroness Chakrabarti said, "We believe in custody time limits in this society. Even suspected terrorists can be held for no more than 14 days. Why should these desperate people be held without limit of time?" She's right, isn't she?
Well, I think there are safeguards still in the existing system around disproportionate, anything that is done that is disproportionate detention. So if you have somebody who has been held in detention and there is no prospect of being able to remove them, then you won't be able to keep them in detention. However, if you have it's the point that Sam Ridley made, that if you have a fixed time limit on something like the sort of immigration, detention and removal, then the risk is that you could get to, concerns that would be raised or challenges that would be made at 26 days. Actually, they might be relatively straightforward to resolve, but they will take more than the additional 2 days. And then there's effectively an incentive to push past the hard deadline of the 28 days. Whether if instead the issue is around the principle of proportionality, it does mean it prevents long-term detention unless you have cases where obviously you've got sort of dangerous foreign national offenders, which are obviously treated in a different way. But you don't have something that could end up being misused or end up being counterproductive.
Is there a presumption of 28 days then?
No, the issue is what can you do with each individual case on a case-by-case basis to be able to make decisions as swiftly as possible and to be able to remove people as swiftly as possible.
28 days apart from exceptional circumstances?
No, the issue is that we try to remove people as swiftly as possible. And, look, bear in mind the whole point is to be able to actually deliver the returns that, are about respecting and enforcing the rules. And you want to therefore use the detention facilities as effectively as possible in order to do that. So, it always has to be about what is the focus on the likelihood of being able to deliver returns.
And if I may, Home Secretary, the other thing we've done in part in response to the Bookhouse inquiry, but more broadly as well, is we have been increasing in recent months our detention engagement teams very significantly. So we've got more of our immigration enforcement teams in the IRCs who can engage with individuals and move their cases forward because we're reducing the ratio of officers to detainees.
I want to move on shortly to other matters, but we've got some questions on the asylum system from Chris Murray and Conor Rand, and then we'll move on to other issues.
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. I want to ask you a bit about the enormous backlog of asylum cases that you've got to clear, and in particular how much it's costing the department. So 2019-20, you were spending $17,000 per asylum seeker. 23-24, you're spending $41,000 per asylum seeker, and the number has been growing. The previous government had attempted to build, to sort of secure larger sites, and I saw the Permanent Secretary last week when we discussed North Eye, which had cost hundreds of millions and it didn't end up working. The Home Office is supposedly working at pace and learning lessons, but how can you be confident that the new models that you're trying to approach, which I understand is smaller sites, moving people out of hotels into smaller sites, is going to work? Because the previous government's attempts didn't work, and that it'll be able to reduce the amount of money that you're spending on accommodating people?
So we need to do two things. The first and most important issue is just to get the backlog right down, because it's that backlog that we've got, that we've inherited, is extremely costly. The second is then to be able to get out of the very costly hotel arrangements and the contracts. And many of those contracts, bear in mind, were signed in a rush in the summer of 2022, and as a result, have not been the most effective way, and have ended up being a huge cost to the taxpayer as well. So we had in the run to the election, I had not expected this. So this was one of the things that did surprise me after the election, was that the asylum decision-making in the run-up to the election effectively just crashed. It had come down, dropped by about 70%. The monthly decisions being made had dropped by about 70%, and the monthly interviews taking place, so effectively the pipeline of decisions, had dropped by 80%. So in July, therefore, what we inherited was a situation where the backlog was shooting back up because there just weren't the decisions being made. We have got decision-making right back up again now. We've got the caseworkers back in place. We've got the decisions churning through. We've got interviews taking place. And so that means that the backlog is now coming down, but that has put additional pressure on through the summer. So we had to get that action being taken so that we can then now keep bringing the backlog down. The second then is what you make sure you're doing in terms of the value for money, in terms of the accommodation that we actually have. And again, you're right, there have been some examples where not just, I think, the Bexhill case, but also Scampton, there have been other cases where huge sums of money put into things that were really just not value for money at all. And what the work that Angela Eagle is taking forward is all about how do you get much better value for money and also work with local authorities on the most effective locations for asylum accommodation, whilst overall trying to bring any need for asylum accommodation right down.
So it's really good to hear the point about getting the backlog down. I absolutely agree with that. But having spent the last 5 years before being elected working with local authorities who are having to respond to the decisions the Home Office takes, setting up hotels without telling them, trying to secure contracts, it can be very, very difficult for local communities. And we do know that tensions are very febrile in local communities about this issue, quite understandably. And what kind of work are you doing to ensure that as you bring down the backlog, people will either be moving to removals, or they will, or appeals, or they will be granted refugee status and will then be able to apply in the mainstream local authority housing, for example, and claiming benefits. That could have a huge impact on local authorities if you're really pushing people through the system. What work are you doing to make sure that local authorities can cope with what's happening and that local communities aren't disadvantaged by that?
So, first thing is just in terms of the progress in terms of the backlog. We currently have just served closure notices on another 7 hotels. So those should be then closing in the new year as a result of bringing the backlog down. So that's the work we're determined to keep making progress on. In terms of then working with local authorities, so the work that Andrew Eagle is taking forward is about setting forward new arrangements with local authorities around determining the most appropriate locations for asylum accommodation, but also then working around what happens once asylum decisions are taken. So in part that then feeds back through to the discussions we were having before about increasing returns and enforcement so that you make sure that the rules are properly respected and enforced. It also means where someone is a refugee who has fled persecution, and then what we want to see is them being able to work and to be able to support themselves or their families as swiftly as possible. We are putting in place now new effectively liaison officers. We call them AMLOs. I'm going to turn to Simon as to what the AMLO stands for now. It's, and that's a test. So we're putting in place the additional liaison officers.
I think it's asylum move-on liaison officers.
There you go. So the move-on officers are then working with local authorities on how you can make sure that where somebody has been granted asylum, that there is swift work at pace to make sure that they can help get jobs, find private rented accommodation that they can fund, and so on as well.
I think I heard you saying that you'll be working with local communities as well for those new setups, so that's really positive to hear. And then my final question is about the other part of this. So they'll either be granted refugee status, they won't, or they could go to appeals. And you're going through a very large backlog, and there's a lot of very complex cases. And appeals are actually really creeping up. I think in some cases it's pushing 50% of appeals are upheld. So what are you doing to ensure the quality of decisions that Home Office officials are taking are robust and actually stand up in the appeal courts so that the system keeps functioning?
Yeah, we have a whole programme of work that is looking at the appeals, both trying to speed up appeals and also trying to make sure that we can increase the quality of decision making. Part of the problem as well, of course, is that I think as well that some of the cases that are going through appeals are cases that were decisions that were taken a long time ago as well. And so the faster that we can get decisions taken, the more effective the system needs to be as well. So this is an area that we have a lot of work underway to try and make sure that we are getting good quality decisions and also trying to speed up the process. But this is a challenge, and be honest, this is an area that is challenging.
I'm going to bring in Conor Rand. There's a few people who've caught my eye, so I will bring you in, but I'm conscious we do need to move on to other things. So quick questions, please. But Conor.
Thank you. And it's good to hear of the government's work in terms of focusing on clearing that huge backlog that had built up. And I think in that discussion we reflect on the huge pressure that asylum hotels put on local communities, local authorities and local infrastructure. And it's clear that they are bad for the taxpayer, bad for communities, and bad for people themselves seeking asylum. Now, I think it's fair to say, have previously been very critical of the asylum accommodation system as a whole. So can you reaffirm that it is the government's commitment to end the use of hotels for housing asylum seekers?
Yeah, we want to end asylum hotels. This is really, I think it's completely inappropriate and extremely costly. And so the costs hit a peak of, I think it was £8.8 million a day last year that was being spent on hotel accommodation. I just think that's just a sort of appalling waste of taxpayers' money to be spending that kind of level of accommodation, because you had both such expensive accommodation, but in particular because the asylum backlog had gone up so high. So the work that we're doing is already saving money, and we are saving hundreds of millions of pounds already. We need to go much further. We have to do that step by step, because we have to clear the backlog, we have to deal with some of the appeals issues, and we have to also make sure that we can work towards a better coordinated arrangement with local authorities. So it does take time to do all of those things, and we have to work through each bit of it step by step. But I think it's really in the interest of having a properly managed, fair, sensible and supported asylum system, and also making sure that you get good value for the taxpayer as well.
Thank you. I've got Joni Reid.
Thank you, Chair. So, Home Secretary, we know that around 50% of asylum applications are initially granted, and that increases on appeal. But the discussion has, I think, and generally is about returns and enforcement. In light of the summer riots, I suppose, is there any plan to develop an integration strategy at top level, or to look at how these communities can really contribute more effectively?
So part of the reason for having the liaison officers in local areas is to be able to do that coordination work with local authorities, so that where a decision has been made, where somebody has fled persecution, you can end up then having the swift arrangements in place to be able to make sure that people can then work, can then be part of a community, and so that you can have that support as well. I think it's actually, if you look at it, some of the resettlement arrangements as well around Hong Kong, for example, or around Ukraine, I think the integration support and the support for people to be able to work, or to be able to get support to be able to be part of a community has been really important. So I think that has to be a central part of the overall approach.
Two quick questions. The first question is, what was the reason, it might be for the officials, what was the reason for that collapse in decision making, 80% drop before the election? What was the reason for that?
So my understanding, and Matthew or someone will correct me if this is fully accurate, my understanding is this was the implementation of the Illegal Migration Act, and in particular the retrospective element of the Illegal Migration Act. So the way that the Illegal Migration Act was drawn up, and sort of incomprehensible that it was drawn up in this way, meant that once you had cases that had arrived after March of 2023, they couldn't be decided. So when decisions had been taken on cases that had arrived in February 2023, and we're onto the March 2023 cohort, they legally could not take decisions. In practice, in theory, they were supposed to be able to take decisions on around half the cohort that weren't covered by the Illegal Migration Act framework, but there was also no way to distinguish between, in practical way, operational way, to distinguish between the people who were covered by the Illegal Migration Act, and therefore you couldn't take decisions, and the people who weren't covered by the Illegal Migration Act, so therefore legally you could take decisions. There was no way operationally to distinguish. So therefore the Home Office was left with a situation where legally they could not take decisions on thousands of cases. So they kept going on the cases they thought they could consider, and so that's why you then had, it drops to like a couple of thousand, 2,000 or 3,000 a month rather than the 11,000 a month that it had previously been. So they're still taking a small number of decisions, but basically the system just gets stuck and clogged up. And had we carried on with that retrospective arrangement, you would have ended up with, sort of tens of thousands more people just stuck in the backlog and with no decisions being made on their cases, and effectively a big increase in hotel use over the rest of the course of this year.
Thank you. And just very, very quickly, the Home Office has got a reputation of working quite siloed over the last few years. I used to be a council leader. And as a council leader, I was in a situation where the Home Office was making decisions around claimants and the council having to pick up and almost pay the same hotel for the same hotel room because the responsibility had passed. When you put on top of that Afghan refugees, temporary accommodation, 500,000 kids in temporary accommodation, emergency accommodation, how will the Home Office ensure that by dealing with the backlog, which is absolutely the right thing to do, you don't just land local government with a huge headache in terms of trying to find accommodation that just simply doesn't exist and it's very competitive in any event?
So that's partly what the Move On officers are designed to do, and that is a new development. What I'm also finding is that, of course, the MCHLG is actually in the same building as we are. And so it's been therefore quite easy to have meetings with the Deputy Prime Minister on exactly these issues. So we have been discussing it directly with these issues. And I think what I've found has been there's been a huge willingness across the Home Office to do much more of that partnership work. I think as long as the system is under kind of pressure with the high backlog, that then becomes harder because decisions are being taken quickly. But actually, if you can get the backlog coming down over time, then that makes that easier.
If I could just come in with one example of breaking down silos with our colleagues in the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. We're working jointly with them on a joint long-term accommodation strategy, which is putting much greater emphasis, as the Home Secretary said, on engagement with local authorities and in a wider variety of different types of sites, not the large sites that the previous government was working on. And as part of that, one of our commitments to local authorities is that if we ever hear that they are interested in using or acquiring any particular accommodation, we will withdraw our interest from that accommodation.
No, I'm going to have to move on. I'm sorry, there's so many questions, but I know this is something the committee is going to look at again. But I do need to move on to policing and crime, and I want to start with Jake Richards.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, to say that the neighbourhood policing commitment to recruit 13,000 new PCSOs is very welcome, especially in constituencies like mine where community policing has been dismantled over the last decade. I just want to get some further clarity, if I may, on how this will be funded. In the letter that you and Diana Johnson kindly sent to the committee, it talks about first steps to delivering the 13,000 neighbourhood policing commitment. In Diana Johnson's statement, it talks about kickstarting the recruitment. If some clarity as to where we are with that.
Yeah. So the statement today sets out the funding for the police forces for the next year. That's the $1 billion additional funding that I set out at the beginning, and what that includes is increases in the core grant. Also, in addition to that, £100 million for neighbourhood policing. £100 million is about sufficient to recruit over 1,000 police officers, but in practice we would expect police forces to be making decisions about the mix of officers, PCSOs, specials and so on that they want to use their share of the funding for. And we've obviously set out, this is a plan over the course of the Parliament for the 13,000 neighbourhood police and PCSOs that we want to see back on the streets as part of neighbourhood policing teams.
It's right, though, isn't it, that the spending review process has started and there are still going to have to be efficiencies to be made, and the government have set out areas that they're looking at in the Home Office. And I also note that the police productivity funding area will be announced for 2025 late next year. I just want to touch, if I may, I'm aware of time because very rudely I have to leave at 4 o'clock for a bill committee, so I will rush through
we had to move on.
what are very complex issues. But just thinking about efficiencies, I wonder if I could ask about two perhaps more long-term changes to policing which may lead to real efficiencies. One is digital ID. At the weekend, I think 7 former Home Secretaries of different parties and Prime Ministers have come out saying that time has come. I just wanted your sort of broad thoughts on that. I noted you spoke about digital approach to borders and e-visas, to Chris's question. And secondly, facial recognition technology. So the police have been very clear that this could lead to widespread efficiencies in policing. It's now 4 years since the Court of Appeal sort of signalled the alarm. There was a letter to the previous Home Secretary in January of this year from the Lords about the lack of a legal framework. I know the government are looking at this. I just wanted a sense of timings and where we are going with those two issues.
Yeah. So on facial recognition, obviously, I mean, this does have significant potential and is being used by some forces. There is no clear sort of overarching governance framework for it, and that means actually that for some police forces they're not really clear in terms of the legal basis and when and where they can use it, and so therefore we have been working now at pace. Dame Diana Johnson has been having a series of meetings, workshops with police forces. South Wales, for example, have put in place effectively a governance structure involving the Police and Crime Commissioner and the Chief Constable on the circumstances in which they would use, including live facial recognition, for example, if they were trying to identify. I think one of the examples that they gave me, and I'll have to clarify if this is inaccurate, was, for example, if they were trying to identify people who they were concerned had been previous offenders who might be arriving at a football match or a major event and who might be expected to cause trouble or something like that. So they would use it in those circumstances, but they had set out a governance structure to be able to do so, but there isn't a sort of formal arrangement to do so, and that as a result means that many police forces feel like they are struggling with lots of different competing bits of regulation and legislation, and it's making it much harder for them to use the technology effectively. So that's the work that Diana Johnson has underway in order to try and be able to support police forces to be able to use the facial recognition technology in the right and appropriate way. And then on the ID thing, so we obviously there's work underway from the DCIT department from Peter Kyle around how you regularise the kind of digital forms of ID that most people have already. The particular issue there, though, where this has often been raised, is around, for example, illegal working. Actually, we already have the biometric permits around that should be used and should, in theory, be able to be used immediately on the spot to identify whether somebody is working lawfully or not. But often the enforcement teams have not had the equipment or technology to be able to do that and to be able to use that. So that's why one of the things that we have just announced is an increase in body-worn cameras for immigration enforcement teams, and also the rollout of biometric kits so that they can do those sorts of biometric checks on the spot rather than having to go to a police station in order to be able to do those sorts of checks.
It's good to hear that the work that Dame Diana Johnson is doing on the facial recognition technology. I just wondered if there's any, I don't expect you to hold you to a date, but any kind of time span for when the government might come forward with a new legal framework, if that is indeed Is that something that's a work in progress?
I will ask Dame Diana Johnson to update the committee on the timescale and the work that she has underway. She has had a whole series of meetings with both policing organisations and community organisations on this.
And the pilots that were, as you said, in South Wales and in the Met are being rolled out. I think there are 6 forces already involved, and there's a plan to involve more. And there isn't a single bespoke governance framework, but there is a lot of governance around the use of live facial recognition, as you expect, including laws in relation to human rights and equality and data protection. And any use of live facial recognition for policing has to be necessary, proportionate and fair. And all of the algorithms are tested for bias before they can be used operationally.
It's just in the 3 forces that are using it, the results, from what I've read anyway, can be quite important. Moving on.
Do you also ask, by the way, just because you also asked about productivity issues and the overall funding things, there's a whole series of other areas where we think that productivity could be improved and also efficiency and savings can be made. And it's why we've set up a commercial efficiencies programme around making sure that you can, even just on procurement contracts, we think there's evidence we can save significant sums of money from procurement contracts, and we do expect all police forces to become part of that, and also changing practices like the way in which redaction requirements are expected on police forces, so that you end up with officers effectively with the equivalent of a bottle of Tipex, having to just redact things before they can send files to the CPS, rather than having a much more streamlined process. So there's a series of areas like that.
The National Audit Office earlier this month produced reports about the link between increasing police numbers and then the pressures on the prison estates, which I know is not, perhaps you're thankful, not under your remit. I just wondered what the relationship between the 2 departments are in terms of modelling for prison capacity, as we're hopefully increasing numbers of police on the beat.
I think the Lord Chancellor is just in the next room giving evidence as we speak, and I'm sure we'll be being asked on some of the prison issues. So the big focus around the neighbourhood policing is obviously around both preventing crime and also tackling some of those crimes around antisocial behaviour, town centre crimes, all of those issues around shoplifting, street theft and so on, where we think we can make a substantial improvement and impact. Of course, we have to do quite close working between departments and across the whole criminal justice system in terms of responding to the scale of the prison crisis that we have had to deal with. But we are also clear that it's extremely important to get more police back on the beat, and that will make our communities safer.
Thank you. Conor Round.
Yes, on the facial recognition technology, just picking up some of the points that Jake made, one area where obviously this could have a very significant impact is around tackling retail crime, assaults on shop workers and antisocial behaviour that blights too many of our high streets, including in Altrincham, my constituency. I just wondered if much thought had been given to that area of work in particular, but also the importance of making sure that we communicate the proportionate use of such technology with people working in such settings, with the public, particularly in light of some of the operational and logistical challenges we've seen in other parts of the world where such systems have been introduced, and especially with the point around bias and protections against bias in the system.
Yeah. So, as the Permanent Secretary has already said, we do have already significant checks in to prevent, to ensure that any facial recognition technology that is used is tested for any bias, because, and they have to actively test for that. There just not be evidence that there is. They have to actively demonstrate that they have tested those as well. So the use of effectively retrospective facial recognition technology has been in place for some time and can be used, for example, in those circumstances about trying to identify somebody. I think the wider issue that if you talk to retailers and about that sort of town centre crime, we've had I think it's a 30% increase in shoplifting in recent years. We've had a 40% increase in street theft. there's a real sense of it being town centre crime that it has a huge impact on the confidence in local communities at the same time as neighbourhood policing patrols have pretty much disappeared in many places. So you need to get the neighbourhood police back into town centres and also make sure that we've got the better arrangements in place for tackling those kinds of crimes that can really impact on confidence in the community. And one of the things that sometimes that retailers will say is that they then struggle to be able to upload the CCTV they may have as the evidence because they haven't got the systems in place, or because of things like the £200 rule, meaning that actually if the thefts are below £200, well, they don't get investigated anyway, even if there is evidence of it being repeat offenders. So I actually think it's much broader than issues about one particular kind of technology or another. It's actually about strengthening the partnership working at local level on those sorts of crimes that have a big impact on confidence.
I absolutely agree, and the work the government is doing in terms of a specific offence, respect orders, alongside the effective and proportionate use of facial recognition technology, can obviously have a huge impact on our high streets. I think it's important that we take people who are working on our high streets and in retail settings with us when we're doing those measures, and I hope that's the approach that the government continues to take in talking to workers and their representative organisations.
And actually, a lot of the work around the tackling retail crime has been very much linked to both the discussions with retailers and also with USDOR, as well as one of the main trade unions representing shop workers as well, who've been heavily involved in the work to get a new offence around assaults on shop workers as well.
Be more.
And just as a follow-up, Home Secretary, on the numbers, you mentioned around 13,000 that you're looking to recruit over the years ahead. Does the department, in terms of the allocation of funding to that 13,000, have any expectation of the split between recruitment of police officers and recruitment of PCSOs?
So in practice, we're going to need to work with police forces on what the different mix will be and the way in which that develops, because that will vary as well from force to force. So some forces, for example, I think Norfolk currently doesn't have any PCSOs at all. There are other forces that have been heavily focused on PCSOs. We want to see a mix of people in policing teams. I think neighbourhood policing teams is best when you've got both officers and PCSOs. They can play different roles in the teams. The starting point figures we had used, and it was literally as a sort of initial indicative starting point, was to look at 3,000 newly recruited police officers, 4,000 newly recruited PCSOs, 3,000 redeployed police officers, so from other areas where, for example, we know there have been high levels of police officers doing back office jobs or having to spend a huge amount of time doing things like the redaction and some of those other things, and another 3,000 as specials, because I think specials are underused at the moment. But that was a starting point, and we've said that, I think, we said that in opposition, as that was a sort of starting point for what the recruitment might look like. But in practice, this is going to have to be worked through with police forces as to what the final mix looks like.
Okay, thank you. I want to just move on to police standards and confidence within policing, just as moving on themes. You announced back in October that there was a package of reforms to rebuild confidence, for police officers and for communities. When will you be publishing a formal response building on the accountability issue, on the concerns that the last administration raised? And when do you anticipate being in a position to release more details on the reforms that you announced earlier?
So I think you're referring to the police accountability reforms after the Martin Blake case announcement. Yes. So the one of the really important issue we were raising as part of that piece of work was that we need to raise public confidence in policing. That's part of our Safer Streets mission, restoring public confidence in policing, and that links back to some of the issues around town centre crime as well, but you've also got to make sure that police officers have the confidence to be able to do the job. And that includes particularly on really important specialist roles. For example, firearms officers is extremely difficult and skilled set of responsibilities that they have, and it's really important that they have the confidence in the system and in the accountability system as well. And there's been a series of cases over many years that have raised concerns there that we were clear to address. One of the things that we announced as part of that was the sort of immediate intention to do things like the introduce anonymity for firearms officers, but there were other areas where we've asked for a piece of work to be done by Sir Adrian Fulford and Tim Godwin, and we're expecting to report early in the new year. And they are looking particularly at a series of areas where there are different thresholds around the misconduct, the inquest, the criminal investigations. And where you have these different thresholds, sometimes as a result of historic court cases, then that can add to delays, add to really perceptions of unfairness in the system, and end up undermining confidence. So we have asked, therefore, this combination of Tim Godwin, who has obviously got the senior police chief background, and Sir Adrian Fulford, who has the senior legal and judicial background, to look together at those multiple thresholds, and we hope will make recommendations. We hope early in the year, and we will obviously publish the conclusions of the work that they come forward with. There are some other areas that we have said we will legislate for in the Crime and Policing Bill, which we expect to be this parliamentary session as well.
And just to expand on that, Home Secretary, in terms of a wider remit that is associated with that, do you, other areas, just expand on what those other areas are likely to be in terms of...
You mean the areas that the police...
police misconduct.
Oh, the police misconduct and the vetting, yes. So we've got then the wider work around the Angelini and Casey, in response to the Angelini and Casey reviews. So that includes... putting a statutory underpinning to the vetting system, so you have national vetting standards. It includes stronger requirements around the action to be taken, for example, suspensions in cases where police officers are being investigated for domestic abuse or sexual assault cases, and also includes training requirements as well. So there were a series of areas. I do have a broader concern, but this is more a sort of a longer term concern than something where there's immediate remedies, that the overall way in which the misconduct system works is that it can very often, when something goes wrong in policing, the focus becomes on an individual police officer and doesn't sufficiently look at, for example, whether the real problem was around the systems that were in place within a police force or the training that was in place within a police force. And it just becomes around, the decisions of an individual officer, whereas actually the reason that those decisions might have been made might have been because of poor training or might have been because of something wider within the force. But that is a sort of broader concern that's harder to address.
Okay.
You'll know we're doing an inquiry on the policing response to the summer disorder, and Joni Reid's got some questions on that.
Thank you, Chair. Just to turn now to the disorder of the summer. You said at the time that the intelligence coordination infrastructure was weak and that the central coordination could be strengthened. I just wondered if you could go into a little bit more detail of what you meant by that and what steps you're taking to address that.
Yeah, and I know this is an area that the committee is doing an inquiry and will be looking into further. And I think probably all of us, whenever on any of these issues around the violent disorder, always have to sort of start by thinking about 3 little girls who lost their lives in Southport, and whose families, will still be grieving, and all the families that were affected by that appalling attack. We then had, as you said, that there's just truly disgraceful violent disorder that then kicked off through the summer, and that was crime. That was just, the burning of Spellow Library and the attacks on a hotel, on the Asylum Hotel, the different, the looting of shops and so on that took place. I think I asked the Manchester Inspectorate of Policing to conduct a review of what happened during that summer disorder and the policing response to it. And the interim report from Andy Cook will be, I think, coming out very shortly. And so I don't want to preempt some of the work that he has done, but just to give you some of my reflections on it. I felt that there was a really strong policing and criminal justice response, rightly, to that violent disorder. And we had, 1,700 arrests, over 700 people charged. We had very fast coordination between the police, the Crown Prosecution Service and the courts in order to be able to respond very swiftly. And we had, at one point, over 6,000 public order officers on the streets, and I think there were 40,000 public order shifts worked by police officers over 10 days, and I pay huge tribute to both the officers who responded and a sort of shameful level of officer injuries. There were 300 officers injured as part of that disorder, and truly disgraceful that police officers came under attack in that way. But also on the senior police chiefs, particularly in the MPCC, who did a lot of the coordination between forces, but it felt at the time that what the scale of the response was dependent on the partnerships between individuals rather than on there being a system in place. And I would say there were two areas where I am concerned that there was not a strong enough system in place. The first was around shared national intelligence, where you had something where there were clearly national interactions. It wasn't just about something happening in one local area. There were national, effectively copycat disorder taking place. We didn't have a system to be able to swiftly stand up. We didn't have a system in place quickly for police forces to be able to share that intelligence. We did stand one up, so we did make arrangements to get that national intelligence in place, and we had the National Crime Agency involved in that, but it wasn't there. And the second area was we didn't have a strong enough system in place for police forces to be able to coordinate with each other to have that national public order policing availability there for police officers that could be deployed swiftly where it was needed. So those first few days, it was very much mutual aid agreements between individual forces, and actually that was much too slow a response. So those are the things that I've sort of asked to be looked at, but those are just some of the issues that the Inspectorate is looking at, and I'm sure we'll be able to give more evidence to your inquiry.
Yeah, I'm sure we will as well. I mean, if you want me to wrap up quickly.
Did you want to come in?
Not on this particular topic.
Can I just ask about the funding, and then I'll bring Paul in. I mean, we heard from police officers, senior police officers last week around the costs that this was to each individual force. Is the Home Office able to reimburse the forces for that?
So this comes part of the special grant procedure. I gave police forces the reassurance at the time that we would ensure there was funding available to them through the special grant process for the additional, they had to do additional overtime. They had to shift resources around in order to be able to respond. We're working through the allocations to each individual force at the moment on that, but we had to be able to give them the confidence. We need to make sure that we follow through, and the Home Office does provide the funding that is needed for forces.
Thank you. Paul?
Thank you, Chair. What role, if any, did police and crime commissioners play in that process?
So I had meetings with police and crime commissioners during that process. I think they were also involved in the work in terms of really making sure that obviously, first of all, they were supporting the police chiefs in making sure that they had sufficient public order police ready. And I think in the early stages, there weren't sufficient public order police in the right locations. And so they had to swiftly respond to that. I think secondly, in some of the communications locally as well, some of the reassurance that needed to be provided, some of the work with communities, because you saw people in communities who were just truly appalled at what was happening, and also some of the work to communicate locally that action is going to be taken. If you're committing a crime, there will be an investigation, the police will prosecute, you will face the full force of the law. So publicising some of those cases, I think, was really important as well.
Now going to move on to violence against women and girls, and back to Joni Reid.
Okay, well, I'll be very quick then. I sense that we want to move on as quickly as possible.
No, you're fine. We're okay. We've got plenty of time for
I
this.
think the whole House is pleased with the target of having violence against women and girls, but there has been a lot of talk around how ambitious the target is. Some might say overly ambitious. So I just wondered if you could go into a little bit of detail about how you're going to identify the policies that will effectively deliver this, and how, crucially, how it's going to be measured.
So you're right, it is really ambitious, and I don't think any government has tried to do this before internationally as well as domestically, but it does feel like we have, everybody has talked about tackling violence against women and girls for a long time, but actually what we've had is incremental change. And what we need in many areas is almost system overhaul. We just need to fundamentally change the way in which institutions respond to violence against women and girls, and the way in which it needs to be just taken much more seriously. It's actually also been troubling how little there is a sort of effective evidence base around it. There's much more effective evidence, for example, on action to tackle knife crime and to tackle youth crime than there is on measures to most effectively tackle violence against women and girls. So that side of the two bits of the mission, in terms of halving knife crime and halving violence against women and girls, it's clearer what the key measures are in terms of the tackling knife crime side of things. On the violence against women and girls, therefore, we've been doing what we call an evidence sprint and gathering evidence, working with experts, working internationally, working with academics to just gather the most effective evidence on what are the things that make the greatest difference. On how to measure progress, we've been working with the Office of National Statistics actually on this, because there isn't a sort of clear measure. What you really want to be able to do is to be able to combine measures around domestic abuse, sexual assault, stalking, some of the kind of biggest kind of crimes that most heavily affect women and girls, but to be able to draw those together in an effective way. And the current system of measuring doesn't really allow you to do that. We also, and so that's what the ONS is working on at the moment, is how you have that effectively combined measure in a robust way. How you also need to look ideally at prevalence, not simply at reporting, because we want reporting to go up. And we have to recognise that because the measures are changing to include coercive control as part of the measures of domestic abuse, those figures will go up before they come down. But actually that reflects society taking those crimes much more seriously as well. Our intention is to draw up a violence against women and girls strategy that is a cross-government strategy to be published next year, and to look at the full range about prevention, what you do in schools around prevention, right through to what happens in the criminal justice system, and also what happens in terms of support for victims of abuse as well.
Thank you for that. I think you're absolutely right about there being a lack of effective evidence in this area, and as a result of that, I think there's a fear that there's going to be a focus on higher volume offences rather than offences that cause the most harm. So are you committed to looking at programmes, or continuing to commit to programmes that really have strong evidence base, work with a small high intervention programs like Drive, for example, rather than, there's a lot of ineffective programs in this space. And lastly, just picking up what you said before, when will we expect to hear from the from the ONS on that work that you mentioned, and will that just be announced as part of the wider strategy?
So the work is underway at the moment. We will set out as part of the strategy really which measures we're going to use. So we've been doing some provisional work at the moment, but we'll confirm it as part of the strategy. But the issue with the ONS will be really the timetables of there needs to not just identify the measures, but also their timetable to be able to conduct those measurements and the point at which they say that the figures are robust as well. So we'll obviously, I think, hopefully be able to update the committee in the new year on that. In terms of how you both target the sort of the greatest volume crimes and also the most dangerous, really, we have to do both. And so yes, things like the Drive programme, things like the targeting of the most dangerous offenders is a central part of this. And we have been looking at really how each individual police force can be identifying, well, who are the most dangerous perpetrators within each police force area that can then, that are the sort of highest risk. The Met has already been doing a version of this, they're called the V100 programme, but there are other police forces who've also been doing versions of this. But it's about how you target the most dangerous perpetrators rather than just, almost ignoring the perpetrators and just focusing on additional protection for the victims. The victims do need additional protection and support, and the domestic abuse protection orders, we think, are extremely promising. We're just starting the pilots now, or the first phase of rollout effectively on those now, but also how you then target the most dangerous offenders.
Thank you. That's really reassuring to hear that there will be a focus on kind of high-risk perpetrators of violence, male violence. Thank you so much.
Can I just check the halving? What's the starting point for halving? Is it the figures before coercive control or the figures after coercive control?
So that's what we're still working through at the moment. I think this will partly depend on the work that the ONS has underway at the moment. I think the reason for saying the halving is because we just think you just need that ambition, that scale of ambition, and to try and get everybody away from just thinking about the incremental change. If you want to really transform things in a decade, what are the big things that you need to change, whether that is in schools, whether that is in the way in which the policing, whether the way in which the criminal justice system, the way in which employers respond to abuse, what are the big things that you need to do?
Thank you. Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Home Secretary. And one of the issues that really concerns me is child sexual exploitation, particularly when we're looking at violence against women and girls. And Greater Manchester published the Rochdale Review, which identified 96 men at present with risk to children, and identified a systematic failures within local authority at that local authority level. Would you agree that the work carried out and commissioned by Mayor Andy Burnham was of good value in terms of identifying those failures?
So I think this was really important, the work. There's been a series of these investigations. So there was the work that was commissioned by the Mayor in Greater Manchester. There's been obviously the ICSA, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse as well. And some of the issues there actually go back to this point about how you identify the most dangerous offenders and how you make sure that they are being targeted and are being dealt with. Some of it is also around how you make sure that systems respond and take seriously child sexual abuse wherever it is found. So the mandatory reporting, for example, that was highlighted as part of the ICSA inquiry, how you make sure every institution is doing its bit to take seriously child sexual abuse. The Safeguarding Minister, Jess Phillips, has met with Alexis Jay recently and has also been meeting with survivors of child abuse as well on what now needs to be done to roll out and implement the recommendations for the independent inquiry. So I think she can also update the committee on the progress that she's made, because she's been taking forward those meetings relatively recently.
And obviously Alexis Jay did a very good report into Rotherham,
yes.
And we've had Mayor Andy Burnham do the Rochdale review, and both of which identified very systematic failures at that local level. And again, in my own constituency of Keighley and Ilkley, I'm deeply concerned around issues around child sexual exploitation around the wider Bradford district. And I was just wondering, given we've had those two reports that have specifically looked at the failings at that local level, and I know I'm getting a lot of constituents coming to me about historic cases that are still working their way through the system, but also live cases that are unfortunately still happening. Would you support a review specifically into child sexual exploitation across the Bradford district, for example?
So I think the overarching issues were that were raised as part of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. The shocking thing is they've not actually been implemented. So we've had one set of recommendations. We've had other recommendations coming out of individual local inquiries. And, it's really important that those are also followed up at local levels as well. But from the Home Office point of view, we want to see the ICSA inquiry recommendations now being taken forward. And actually there's been, I think, too slow progress. It's about 2 years, I think, now since they reported. So we have got to make sure that those recommendations are now being implemented. That does mean that each local authority also needs to look at their responsibilities, to look at making sure that standards are properly being met, and also making sure that they are looking at those recommendations as well.
Just as a final question before moving on, one of the key concerns that keeps getting raised is this feeling of disenfranchisement by those victims, or indeed their families, in the state, whether the state be local authorities or anyone that has safeguarding responsibilities. And that's certainly been something that's raised to me, but also things that were highlighted really in the reports that are being carried out. And there are different complexities in different areas, and that's why I fear, based on correspondence and conversations that I'm having, that the scale of some of the complexities associated with child sexual exploitation across the Bradford district would be of a far greater number than, say, even in Rochdale or in Rotherham. So I was just wondering, given those concerns that are being raised not only by myself but others, a former colleague of yours, Anne Cryer, for example, a previous MP that represented Keighley, do you think that would warrant having a review that's an inquiry that specifically looks at child sexual exploitation across the Bradford district, where those complexities are undoubtedly apparent?
Well, I just think this is an issue for every single local authority and for every single area. So I think every area has to look at whether its safeguarding arrangements are strong enough, whether they have got strong enough support for victims, support for people who are coming forward. So if you've got victims and families who are coming forward and identifying serious problems around child sexual abuse, including historic problems, because where, for example, there have been historic issues involved, it's really important that those survivors and those victims have a voice, whether they have that voice at local level, at national level, and in every area and in every community. It's really important. So I think there can't be any holds barred on this. You always have to make sure that victims and survivors get support, local level and at national level. But I do think this is also something that really, it's a responsibility for every head of children's services. It's a responsibility for every local council. It's also a responsibility for other kinds of institutions, for whether that be NHS, faith institutions, other kinds of organisations as well. What the independent inquiry, the national inquiry, made clear is you have this patterns of abuse not being taken seriously enough, or institutions not responding at the highest level in all kinds of different organisations. So I would urge vigilance on every kind of local organisation and national organisation in terms of being able to address this.
I think Sean's got some further questions, and I'm going to, then Chris I'll bring in, and then we'll move on to the final topic.
You're quite right. The independent inquiry reported in October 2022, and in June 2023, Alexis Chair, the chair, said she was deeply disappointed that her recommendations hadn't been taken forward by the then government. Do you have a timeline for when the recommendations will be fully reviewed and a response given by the new Home Office and you as the new Home Secretary?
So what I would do on this one, if that's okay, Chair, is ask the Safeguarding Minister to write to you. I am just conscious that she has held meetings very recently, both with Alexis J and also with groups around survivors of child sexual abuse as well. So I think if she can update you directly on the next steps on that.
Thank you, Secretary. And can you also ensure that response also confirms that where there are local reports, that those recommendations are taken into the mind of the Home Office and that informs policy development going forward?
Yes, I will. And actually, when the Greater Manchester reports came out, I did speak directly to Andy Burnham about the content of those reports and also about what his next steps were going to be and what the local next steps were going to be. So we do also take really very seriously the local reports, be it the Greater Manchester ones, some of the other, the Rochdale and other ones as well. So that is immensely important.
Chris Murray.
Thanks, Chair. Home Secretary, could I ask you about a group of women who have faced extreme exploitation and violence, which is women who've been trafficked into the UK. Can you tell us about your plans to reform and improve the national referral mechanism, in particular for the victims of sex trafficking and exploitation?
Yeah, so you're right, the system has sort of got a bit stuck, and we've ended up with these very long delays in the national referral mechanism. So one of the things that we have done is recruit 200 additional staff members in order to be able to speed up and to clear the backlog for the national referral mechanism. We're looking at future support services around the victims of modern slavery, trafficking and so on as well. And the other issue that we, I think, also need to address at some point is obviously we have, within the numbers at the moment, there are sort of different arrangements for children and young people who are actually ending up victims of county lines. There are sort of parallel arrangements that they become transferred into with local authorities, which is probably actually the more effective response for those. But one of the things we're looking at is, are we getting the system right around currently the way in which we're bringing all of those groups together under the same umbrella system, rather than making sure that they each get the more dedicated support of the kind that they need.
You'll be pleased now we're moving on to our final topic, and we're going to start with Sean Davis.
Thank you, Chair. Home Secretary, we've mentioned knife crime already, and it's remained very, very high in this country despite measures being brought in over the last 10 years. What plans do you have to reduce this crime, and do you see the violent reduction units, particularly in London, as key to that across the country?
Yeah, so we've just confirmed today the continuing funding for the violence reduction units next year. We want to work more closely with the violence reduction units on the focus particularly around the ambition to halve knife crime over the next 10 years alongside the halving the violence against women and girls. And just to take a step back for a second, in terms of the way in which the Safer Streets mission is framed, it's about reducing the most serious violence and rebuilding confidence in policing and the criminal justice system. So on that serious harm side, the violence reduction units are doing some very important work, but we want to work with them on how we better focus around some of the evidence about what is most effective. We've established the Coalition to Tackle Knife Crime, which particularly draws in families of those who have tragically lost loved ones. through knife crime and who often have been the most powerful advocates, often in the most unimaginable and unthinkable circumstances and deeply distressing circumstances, but have been hugely powerful advocates for reform. So we've had the Coalition to Tackle Knife Crime. We've got the new measures around the zombie-style knife ban that came in the summer, but also consulting on the ninja sword ban as well, but also the review into the online sale of knives, which the National Police Chief lead, Stephen Clayman, is carrying out. And that reflects the experience of that Pooja Kanda, who's been has been campaigning on after her son Ronan was killed by a teenager who was able to buy a knife online, pick it up from the post office. It was a ninja sword. He was able to pick it up from the post office and with no proper checks in place at all. So you've got to actually look at all of the things in place along the system. So yes, this is a combination of what you can do nationally and also what you can do locally through things like the violence reduction units.
Some of these knives, I mean, they're terrifying just to look at. Is there a need to consult on them, or can we not just move to a ban on them as a matter of urgency? What's the point of consulting on them? Because, I mean, some of them, it's very difficult to come up with any lawful explanation as to why you'd want one of those in your premise or on your person.
Well, I think we should frame it as we are consulting on our intention to ban the ninja swords. There is a process that we go through, and but we will want to implement a ban as soon as possible, but we do go through a consultation first.
And just on stop and search, your views on the use of stop and search by police officers in this regard?
Stop and search is a really important policing tool. Of course, it has to be used appropriately, but it also is a really important tool for policing, including on things like preventing knife crime. There was a review carried out by the Inspectorate a few years ago about how you make sure that all police forces have got the right standards and so on in place, and that is the sort of standards I would recommend that all police forces follow when they are using stop and search, and that I think was a very effective report, but it's a really important tool.
Thank you. Margaret Mullane.
Thank you, Chair. Home Secretary, in the what you mentioned earlier with confidence in the communities, antisocial behaviour has a huge and terrible impact on communities. So the government's going to bring in respect orders to make it easier for local authorities and the police to actually deal with this. The question I would ask really is, why do you feel these powers are necessary when there are existing powers that are already available to both? And did the police and local authorities actually ask the government to do this?
So I had a conversation with it was a local authority enforcement officer who used to be a neighbourhood police officer. And he described to me really powerfully, we were standing in the town centre, and he said, you know, we used to be able to, when we've got these repeat perpetrators, because we were talking about real problems with antisocial behaviour in the town centre, he said, we used to be able to ban someone from the town centre, where you've got a repeat perpetrator. Now, he said, we can take out an antisocial behaviour injunction, but normally it doesn't have a power of arrest. So if it's then breached and we've got the same people, the same repeat offenders, walking around the town centre again, causing all the same havoc, well, even if the neighbourhood police are there, they can't actually arrest them and do anything about it. And you can get a criminal behaviour order, but that relies on all of the paperwork being ready at the point of conviction for another offence. And again, that can be sometimes just difficult to coordinate between the local authorities and the police and so on. So the point about having the respect orders is to be able to have a proper power of arrest, to be able to have it's effectively kind of antisocial, it's like a modernised ASBO, to be able to bring it in, to be able to have a power of arrest where you've got repeat offending on antisocial behaviour, for example, in town centres, and people who are causing havoc and creating a misery for everybody else.
And could I ask, I mean, I'd say this is, in my say, it's vital really, so I welcome it wholeheartedly. But obviously the police want to step up and the local authorities, they want to deal with that. But do you feel that, you know, when the new police teams arrive, that that abstractions are going to be an issue. They in their heart, they want to be there dealing with it, but the reality is that they're often abstracted out of the area.
So one of the reasons we worked with the College of Policing on drawing up a neighbourhood policing guarantee and a new sort of performance framework really for neighbourhood policing, and we're continuing to work with the police forces on this, is how you have a system so that you can actually prevent the high levels of abstraction, how you can make sure that you've got neighbourhood officers who are properly based in the community. And look, of course, you know, emergencies happen or particular incidents happen, but actually too often we're seeing routine abstraction. We're seeing routinely people, when I spoke to some officers in the Midlands about this, who were saying, you know, yet they were half their neighbourhood team was on 3 to 6 month abstractions. So it wasn't just, well, one day something terrible had happened that they had to cover for. This was for, you know, several months. So you've got to have something which is about really embedding the neighbourhood teams in the communities so that they know the communities and so that the communities know who the officers are, so they've got a guaranteed person they can contact to be able to get in touch, to be able to pass on that local intelligence. So we really go back to that heart of the spirit of the British policing model, which was officers in the community, you know, that Peel principle, the public are the police are the public. It's that close working that I think makes all the difference.
Thank you. And on the violence against women and girls, I thought it's very good what the government is proposing, but do you feel that the police are operationally independent from the government, and how do you think that the government's priorities are going to be taken seriously with all that the police have to contend with, basically?
So it's a fundamental principle of British policing that they are operational independent, that sort of principle is rooted right through the heart of British policing and remains immensely important, and there will always be their operational independence in terms of particular investigations, in terms of local priorities, in terms of how they respond to crimes and deal with that in an operational way. But I think we can also say at a national level there are these missions for the whole government, for policing, and that includes the missions around halving violence against women and girls and halving knife crime. My experience of talking to the police since the election has been overwhelmingly the police want to work in partnership with government. I think this idea you have this approach where, you know, the Home Office stays way away from on policing and just shouts from a distance at policing when things go wrong, that in the end undermines confidence, because actually what you need is the partnership, because there are some things that only policing can do. There are some things that you actually need government partnership, for example, working with other government departments on prevention programmes and so on, that you need that government working alongside policing if you're really going to deliver results.
Thank you.
We've got two more final questions, Sean Davis and then Paul Kohler.
Just in terms of the piecemeal work around how policing is operated, and there are some really good police forces and some not so good, and there's some that are innovating and some not so good. How do you ensure that the standards across all police forces are good and outstanding? And do you think a reorganisation of police forces in the same way that maybe the Deputy Prime Minister's thinking about local government is something you need to consider or not?
And can I add on the back of that, where police forces have taken steps to innovate, that they're not then punished in funding settlements or anything like that because they've taken the steps and the measures that they needed to take and others have yet to do so?
So we are keen to do a major programme of policing reform, but we want to do this with the Home Office working with policing in order to be able to do this, and we are working at the moment on really establishing joint teams to be able to work together to draw up proposals for a white paper sometime next year on policing reform. Some of the component parts or the issues that we want to cover, and again to do this working with policing, are around standards, around that includes some of the vetting misconduct standards, but actually also includes the standards for police forces as a whole, and having a new performance framework for policing that we draw up with the College of Policing, but a new performance unit in the Home Office that can actually do, right, be clear about. This is the shared data that all police forces need to be gathering. It's shocking, actually, that there's areas around response times, for example, that there just isn't consistent information across police forces about response in a way that there is for ambulance and fire and so on. That there's other areas around violence against women and girls, for example, where, again, we just don't have consistent data. Now, what that means is, actually, even for a local chief or a local PCC or a local mayor, they can't tell whether actually their force is performing really well compared to other forces or really poorly. So having that shared information and raising standards is extremely important. And then in terms of what we're looking at across forces, is rather than looking at some of the sort of historic debates that have been had about, you know, different forces merging or anything like that, instead starting from what are the issues that should be done at local level, what are the things that should be done at national level, and particularly looking at things like procurement at some certain shared services, so things like forensics or helicopters, or how many of that could be done as part of a national policing body, a new national policing body that could then provide those. And as a, for example, West Yorkshire Police currently deliver NPAS, the aviation, effectively the helicopters, but that means they have to spend a huge amount of time each year negotiating the funding across 43 different police forces for helicopters that we all need and we know needs to be done at a national level. So actually there must be a much better way of doing some of those kinds of services around forensics, around helicopters and so on.
Because we talk about innovation, I mean, Bedfordshire Police, for example, have cracked the reduction issue a long time ago, but you still talk to other police forces who still are battling with that issue, which seems bizarre, given that we should have a national police service delivered at a local level. Will you mandate and penalise those forces that are slow to embrace new technology and new innovations that other police forces have demonstrated time and time again it works?
Yeah, and I think this also links in, to your question, Chair, about how you make sure you can encourage innovation, but then you also make sure innovation isn't penalised, but also make sure that you then get take-up of successful innovation in other police forces right across the country. We don't currently have a strong enough framework to be able to do that. I don't want that framework to just be designed by the Home Office, because that's got to be done in conjunction with policing to make sure that that is as effective as possible. But I think there are areas where you can't carry on with a sort of 43 voluntary arrangements, where you do need more coordination and where actually it does need to be more of a requirement for police forces to sign up to things. Now, again, we'll determine that in those areas with police forces. It needs to be done in the most effective way, but it's just, there are all these different police forces. I've got to talk to police chiefs who say they're having to become experts on record management systems and IT for individual police forces, because all the police forces are doing things differently and all getting sometimes, you will have companies can easily play forces off against each other as to which contract you should be going for, whereas what you actually want is interoperable arrangements across all police forces to be able to use compatible technology, because so many crimes will cross local borders. They need to be able to share information and cases as swiftly as possible. So that's what we want to work with police forces to do. I think the Home Office has been very hands-off in the past. You can neither be hands-off nor attempt to run things from the Home Office. It's got to be that partnership between policing and the Home Office, and that is what we hope to do.
Final question, Paul Kohler.
Yeah, thank you, Home Secretary. Sir Mark Rowley has recently spoken about a £450 million funding shortfall. His plans to cut 2,300 officers, 400 staff. I've looked at Dame Diana Johnson's statement. I think it says he's going to get £65 million more than he was expecting. 3 quick questions. Am I right? Is that enough? And have you spoken to him about it?
Yes, I have spoken to him, and we have announced as part of the police reform programme, the police settlement that we've announced today, is a £65 million increase in the National Capital City grant. And that reflects two things. First of all, the existing grant for the capital cities, because they obviously do have lots of national events that will take place in the capital that are different in terms of the pressures on policing compared to other parts of the country. That funding hasn't been uprated with inflation for at least 5 years, and arguably before that either. And secondly, we've obviously had in the last 12 months the big increase in protest activity since the October 7th attacks last year. And I think it's really important they are able to properly police protest activity to make sure that the capital can stay safe as well. So that's the reason why we have provided that additional funding.
Is it enough?
So I think we are clear. This is I think the Mayor has described it as the biggest increase for Met Police funding for many years. We know that police forces right across the country have faced very significant pressures, financial pressures in recent years. So we recognise that. But this overall is a 6% increase in the cash funding for police forces, a 3.5% real increase. It does include funding to cover, for example, the national insurance contributions, and it does include additional funding to get neighbourhood police on the beat. So I think this is a demonstration of how seriously we take funding and the investment that police forces need, both in London and in every other community right across the country, to get police back on the beat and keep us safe.
Thank you very much, Home Secretary Sir Matthew and Mr Ridley. We do appreciate you coming in, and I apologise, we've gone slightly over the time we were hoping to do it in, but it's been, as you can see, very extensive questioning. Thank you, committee, as well, for all of your work and contributions, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year, but happy Christmas.
And to you, Chair, thank you very much, and happy Christmas to you all.
Order, order.